Welcome everyone to this evening's event. My name is Sophie. I'm part of the team here at Christchurch who are hosting the event tonight. We are set for a fascinating evening ahead. I hope you're already enjoying your meal in front of you. This evening is going to be split into different elements. First of all, we are going to have a chance to have an interview. Our guest tonight is Dr. Natalie Chong. She is a research scientist with specialty in the genetic area of science. She's going to be sharing her life story with us today, and particularly helping us to think about her and how her faith in Christianity, her trust in Jesus, interacts with her scientific research and understanding of the world. Then we'll have a bit of a pause, time for some filling, and at that point, we'll have an opportunity to hear from Neil Powell, who will be also interviewing Natalie tonight. Neil is part of the London Project, the director of the London Project. He, at that stage of the evening, will be sharing a bit with us about what the faith of the Christian faith actually says and how that picks up some of the threads, some of the themes of what we've been hearing about in the interview, and listening to that more from the words of Jesus himself. The third part of the evening, you would have the opportunity to get involved in, and that's the chance to throw in any questions that you would like to hear the answer on. And with that, let me introduce our special guest up to the stage.
Thank you for your welcome, everyone. Just in case you weren't sure, I'm Neil. Just in case, I'm not going to be answering any questions tonight on science. It's lovely to have you here. Thanks for coming out to Wood and Meal. And if this is the first of these events you've been to, well, special welcome. And I think we're going to have a really interesting evening. And we need your participation. So do use that Slido. As you hear things, do think about questions that you might want to ask, or just track questions that are being asked, and if you think, that's my question, then you can sort of pick up or whatever it is, and we'll make sure that the most popular questions are the ones that we get round to answering. But I know we're here to hear Natalie's story as someone who's both a Christian and is also a scientist. So we're really excited about that. We're all going to learn about science tonight, which is amazing. So we're going to learn something. And I'm doubly excited because Natalie and I have been friends over a very long period of time. And but it's our first time ever doing anything like this together before. So Natalie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Natalie, I'm married to Will, who is sitting here and kindly drove me all the way from Essex to be here tonight. We've got two girls, Eden, who is 7, and Margot, who is 4. And met Neil when I was 18, which is longer ago than I care to say, back when I was a student at Birmingham University and went to Church in Birmingham. And actually Neil and his wife, Jane, actually did marriage prep for when Will and I were considering getting married, and actually we've been married 50 years this summer, so they did something right with the marriage prep.
And I'm feeling very, very old at your wedding as well. So who's looking after the kids tonight?
Will, the parents are very kindly looking after them, so hopefully by now they'll be getting them into bed, or they'll be running wild, who knows, but...
I think they're running wild, probably. So you are a doctor?
I am. By PhD, not by medical, so if there's any medical issues, don't come seeking advice from me.
Can't help.
Can't help.
We'll look elsewhere for that tonight. So PhDs, that's quite intimidating.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what's your area of research?
Yeah. So firstly, I agreed that a PhD was intimidating, and when actually I was an undergrad and my lecturers suggested I did a PhD, mainly because I hadn't actually thought through about what to do when I finished my undergrad. I thought the idea of a PhD for me sounded absurd, and I said no thanks, I don't want to do that. But then when I realised I could either finish uni and not have a clue what I was going to do, or as it turned out, be paid to become a doctor, I thought that sounded like a good idea. So that's the main reason I ended up doing a PhD, which is actually not a brilliant reason for doing it. But anyway, my actual PhD was quite niche. It was in plant genetics, and it was basically, I was trying to find the male genetic component of pollen. So some plants have developed a mechanism called self-incompatibility, which is...
I have something with my wife talks about self-incompatibility, so maybe you can help me later.
Self-incompatibility is basically where some plants have developed mechanisms so they can't self-pollinate. So basically when the pollen, which is within the male component, lands on the stigma, which is in the flower, which contains the female component, the two genetic components work like a lock and key mechanism. So if the pollen is from the same plant or a genetically identical plant, that lock and key mechanism recognises each other, and it recognises it as self, and then triggers a very, very complex series of chemical reactions in the pollen, which essentially tells it to die. Whereas if the pollen from a genetically different plant lands on the stigma, that lock and key mechanism recognises it as different, and the pollens can grow and pollinate. So before I came to do my PhD, the female genetic component had been identified, and my PhD was trying to find the male component, which we thankfully did manage to find. So I got my PhD and wrote quite a nice paper on it as well.
And that's a world first.
Well, a world first in poppy pollen male genetic component. I'll take that. I'll take that.
I mean, you're the world's leading expert on something.
In a very, very niche area. Yeah.
And what's the advantage of cross-pollination? I think, is that the right word, over self-pollination?
Yeah, I think, to put it crudely, it's probably one of, like, for example, in humans, why brothers and sisters and cousins shouldn't have children. It's actually you get an enrichment of genetic pollen. So obviously humans haven't developed a mechanism to self-destruct if that tries to happen. So in consanguineous, it's called populations where there's more intermarriage between mainly cousins, you get a lot more genetic problems, but some plants have developed a mechanism to actually stop that. So that's probably why they've evolved to do that.
And where did the sort of science when did it start for you to be sort of, our science is where I want to go?
So I kind of fell into it. I was just, I enjoyed it at school. I think I very nearly ended up doing optometry. So I enjoyed, I was a bit of a geek, so I did maths, physics and biology at A-level, and I actually thought I was going to go down the physics route, and I started actually at Aston University in Birmingham doing optometry, and then quickly realised I didn't actually want to look at eyes or lenses for my life, so I transferred to Birmingham Uni to do biology, and I actually just really enjoyed all the genetics modules, so I ended up choosing genetics modules, which ended up specialising, getting a degree in biology, specialising in genetics, and then, as I said earlier, then got kind of suggested the idea of doing a PhD, which I then kind of fell into.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so, what is your job description? What is your job title now?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm to clarify, I'm not a research scientist now. I actually work in diagnostics. So it's for me, I feel like I need to define that. For most people, probably, who cares? They don't really know what the difference is. But I work in diagnostics as a clinical scientist. So I work
which in simple terms?
Simple terms is basically I specialise in rare genetic diseases in humans, and I'm basically looking at patients' DNA and comparing that to normal DNA and basically trying to work out if there's a difference in a patient's DNA, which explains why they're ill. That's a simple explanation.
And for those who are a bit more geeky or a bit more sciencey, can you take that up a notch?
Yeah. I'll try to keep it simple, even though I get technical. So basically, someone who is ill and has a suspected genetic disorder would see a doctor. They would usually get referred to a specialist, which would normally involve seeing a clinical geneticist. And if they did think that that person had a suspected genetic disorder, then they would refer for genetic testing. So they'd take either a blood sample or a saliva sample that they'd extract DNA from, which would then get sequenced, and that's where people like me come in. And essentially then what happens is you align a patient's genome, which is all of their DNA, and you align that against a reference or a normal genome. And essentially, you're looking for the differences between the patient genome and the reference genome. But what's tricky about that is that there are thousands of differences between any two genomes. So in this room here tonight, you'll have thousands and thousands of differences between all of our genomes. And most of those differences aren't having a detrimental impact or having any effect on your well-being. But if you're a person with a genetic disorder, then that's different. So what we want to do as clinical scientists is try to narrow down those thousands of differences into a more manageable number. So we can do that using lots of different filtering techniques. So looking at one particular variation, how common is that in the general population? So there's lots of data sets we can look at, where it is in the genome, what kind of effect it's predicted to have on the protein, and lots of other ways of filtering. So then we get down to a hopefully more manageable number of variants to interrogate. So that might be anywhere between maybe 5 and 50. And then I guess where the expertise comes in is that we then want to look for evidence that will hopefully categorise those variants into either benign, so they're those that are not disease-causing, or those that are likely to be disease-causing and therefore provide an explanation for disease. And then I'd say probably one of the most challenging things is at the end trying to write a report that condenses all that information into an understandable format and goes back to a doctor that then gets relayed to the patient. Was that, did I lose you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried to look as if I was confident. And forgive me for asking this, but when will computers put you out of the job?
So people thought that probably about 10 to 15 years ago, and whoever gets to decide these things in their not so wisdom basically stopped training as many clinical scientists because people did think computers and AI would take over. And it is helping. So in the company that I'm in, we do actually have an AI and machine learning team. And for some of the really simple cases, that does do some of the work. But it's really complicated, and you do need humans to help interrogate this stuff. So actually, one of many reasons for lots of backlogs in the NHS at the moment is that there aren't enough trained clinical scientists. So if anyone fancies a change of career, it doesn't pay the best, but it's certainly a rewarding job to do, and there's a shortage of us.
Okay, so maybe that's a career option this time. A bit late for me, I think. So you're a scientist, and I think we're all in awe of scientists generally, and the kind of science that you do sounds fascinating and remarkably helpful. So what, thinking now back to your early years, was there any connection between being in science and belief in anything out there, a God or Christian God in particular, or not really? Or
I wouldn't say that it was science that got me thinking about Christianity, but I can certainly share my story about what caused me to become Christian. I grew up in a non-Christian home. I had no clue about Christianity at all. I grew up with my mum and my twin sister, and I think we may have gone to church possibly once or twice in our whole life, maybe for a wedding and a funeral. And as far as I'm aware, we didn't even have a Bible in our house. So I really had no clue about the Christian faith at all. And I think the first thing that probably got me and my sister thinking about bigger questions in life and God was when our granddad died, when we were age 10, and we were really close to our granddad, so that's quite a big event that happened for us. And I think that just got us asking questions like, is there a God? What's the point in life? Is this it? Kind of, I think even at the age of 10, just thinking, and we just get born to live and then die. And I think we had a lot of questions at the age of 10 but no answers. And I guess between the age of 10 and 16, 17, God brought a few different Christians across our path who shared a bit about the Christian faith. There was one particular family who actually a lovely, lovely Christian family looking back. They're wonderful Christians, but they were a little bit full on, I'd say, with the whole Christian thing. And actually, they had two sons who were similar ages to me and my sister, and we went along to their youth group a few times. And they didn't do anything wrong, but they did make me and my sister basically think Christians were weirdos. So I then became one. So I'd say at the age of 14 or so, we kind of thought, not really sure, kind of hold, not Christians that are meant, but the Christian message, that we're kind of fine to be friends with Christians, but I'm not really interested in the message that you've got. And then me and my sister got to college, and I'd say God had different ideas about us wanting to hold the Christian message at arm's length, because he brought, I'd say, more persistent Christians into our lives, and ones that were slightly less weird, although I'd hate for that family to know that I described them as weird. They're not weird, they just seemed weird at the time, because I didn't have any clue about Christianity, so it just seemed a bit, it was alien, I think. Anyway, these new friends at college, who were really, really wonderful bunch of friends, kept saying to my sister and me, we come along to church, or would you come along and find a Christian union? And for quite a while, we managed to get away with the answer of, been there, tried that, thought it was a little bit weird, so no thanks. What I often say is my sister caved in first, so she went along to events at a church in Nottingham, not too dissimilar to this, and actually she became a Christian, and that was a really big deal for me, because we're identical twins, and we really had done everything the same in life up until then. So it's just kind of like, for me, like what's just happened, and she changed, I'd say, in a good way, and she started to have some of the answers that we've been to the questions we've been asking since we were 10. So that was really significant. And then her and my college friends asked me if I'd do something called a Christianity Explored course, which does what it says on the tin. Basically gives you an opportunity to explore the Christian faith.
How was that?
It was actually really, really good. It was the first time I'd actually really heard the Christian message. I realised I'd been around Christians for a long time, but I really didn't have a clue what the core of the Christian message was, or what the Bible said. So it was going along to that course where I realised even really the fundamental basics of what the Bible says, that God created the world, and that mankind had turned its back on God, and that God's provided a solution by sending Jesus to that. And I think through doing that course, I came to the realisation that Jesus is who he says he is, and there's compelling evidence for that, and that actually the Bible makes real sense of the world that we see around us. And I think some people have light bulb moments when they can look back and pinpoint that they became a Christian. I don't have that, but I'd say over a period of a couple of months, I definitely realised that God was real, and that I'd been living in his world and enjoying all his good things and completely ignoring him for 18 years. So over that period of time, I basically realised I couldn't continue to do that, and so turned back to God and asked for forgiveness, and asked for basically help to try and live the way that he wants me to live. That was over 20 years ago now.
So more of your life now.
Yeah, more of my life as a Christian than not, yeah.
And how has that journey been? Have you ever doubted your...
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, if any Christian is honest, I think most of us would say we have ups and downs in the Christian faith, and I think you can definitely have periods where you doubt, but I think often it comes back to looking at the Bible and asking the question, do I believe what the Bible says? Yes. is there evidence for Jesus being who he says he is?
So faith is more than just emotions or a subject.
Yeah, 100%. It's based on evidence as we see it in the Bible. Obviously there is faith involved, but yeah, but I'd say overall it's been a great journey. There's never a moment where I've regretted a choice to become a Christian.
So that key word, thank you for sharing that, Natalie. That key word there you used was evidence. And obviously evidence is a big part, well, it's a huge part of your working life. But a lot of people wonder whether Christianity, maybe religion in general, but Christianity cuts our focus tonight, and science, well, they're just mutually exclusive ideas. One is a flight of fancy and the other is looking hard at evidence. So how was it for you then, going through your undergraduate, PhD, the work you do now? Have you found that as a Christian, is it possible to be both a scientist and a Christian?
I hope so. I'd say so. Obviously, I am both a Christian and a scientist. Yeah, I think I would definitely say my background in science and my work in genetics has only ever worked to reinforce my faith in a God. So I mean, it's specifically in the area of genetics, but I mean in any area of science, it's so complex. But for me, in the work I'm doing now, I look at the human genome, which is made up of 3 billion letters, 3 billion, which are all precisely ordered in order to form our complex human bodies and to make them function. And in my area of work, I see the devastating impacts of just when one letter out of the 3 billion DNA code goes wrong. And for me, that level of complexity and order so clearly points to a creator behind it. And actually, I think I want to say to people who say actually Christian and science are mutually exclusive, almost, I'd say, doesn't it take more faith to believe that this world and everything in it has come about by complete chance than to believe that there's a God who created it? And actually, I remember hearing, it was actually your colleague, Hugh Thompson, back at the Bristol pub in Birmingham, who gave this analogy, which has stuck with me for over 20 years. He likened the chance of the 3 billion letters of DNA coming together in just precisely the right order to form our complex human bodies to being like a tornado sweeping through a scrapyard and forming a jumbo jet, which is just implausible. I think that was Hugh, unless it was you. I'm giving Hugh credit.
Yeah, well, let's give it to Hugh. So Hugh is a consultant surgeon. Those who were here on Monday and Piyush and Hugh know each other from their time. They were both surgeons in Cambridge. So that guy you were referencing is apparently fine as well now. Yeah.
And the surgeon.
That's astonishing. Say it again. The same chance.
The same chance of the DNA coming together in precisely the right order to form our complex human bodies is like a tornado sweeping through a scrapyard and forming a jumbo jet. It's so improbable.
So for you, it's not faith to believe; it's faith to not believe.
Yeah, and well, actually, I've read a really interesting quote from a well-known English, well, I say well-known, I actually hadn't heard of him, but apparently he's very well-known, English philosopher called Anthony Flew,
I'll reference him a little later.
So actually, he was a very outspoken atheist for a majority of his life, and actually at the age of 81, he, shocked and dismayed the unbelieving world when he completely changed his mind and said that actually he thinks there is a God because of the research into DNA and the complexity that is required in order to form life. He said, points to the fact that there must be intelligent design behind it.
Yeah, good. Well, I didn't know you were going to say that. I'm going to be mentioning.
Oh, sorry, stole your thunder.
This is all good stuff. So that's fascinating that actually your work has only confirmed and strengthened your Christian. You're going with the evidence, and you're finding the evidence in your day-to-day work that's sort of pushing towards confirming your faith in God. But still, sometimes people wonder or wrestle with questions, and maybe people here who are themselves Christians wrestle with this one, which is, what about the laws of science and God kind of doing weird stuff in the world? If you read the Bible, strange things happen. miracles, we might call them, isn't that breaking the laws of science? How do you deal with that as a...
Yeah, so I guess firstly I want to say that that is a hard thing to get our heads around. I think we don't see miracles day to day, or certainly not in the Western world, and so it is hard sometimes to believe that miracles can happen. But I think I want to say that surely if anyone could define the laws of science, it would be the God who defined them in the first place. So I think I don't have any issue with the God who created this world and everything in it. If he wants to defy those laws of science, then he absolutely can. And you're right, we do see a lot of miracles in the Bible, and I think especially concentrated around the time when Jesus was about. And actually the miracles were one of the primary ways that he proved his identity as God. And I think we'd probably be asking the flip question that surely actually, if someone did come to the earth and claim to be God but couldn't do miracles, we'd have good reason to doubt his claim to be God. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good.
But also actually, my husband helped me think about this one, which again is a good answer that I'm going to say. Thanks all. Looking at Jesus' opponents in the Bible, so the New Testament has 4 eyewitness accounts of when Jesus walked the earth, and actually...
You have one of them on your tables, this one, which we'll look at a little later.
So there's actually quite a lot of people who really oppose Jesus and would have absolutely loved to discredit his claims to be God. And actually, you never see them once denying or disputing that the miracles happened. You see them getting in a bit of a state about what day of the week he was performing miracles or by what power he was performing miracles. But they never once suggested that those miracles didn't actually happen. So for Jesus' opponents, to not be discrediting Jesus, actually I think is really compelling and persuasive to suggest that actually those miracles really did happen and they can happen.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe you want to follow up on that in one form or another on the slide there. So you're a Christian and you're a scientist. Sometimes people wonder exactly what Christianity is in a nutshell, if you like. So we have ideas about religion and religious ideas, but how would you describe Christianity to those who maybe are looking into it for the first time?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes helpful to say what it isn't before saying what it is. So I think some people can think that Christianity is a load of rules and regulations that Christians have to follow and that God is out to spoil our fun, which is not true. So in a nutshell, the Christian faith is it's good news for starters, and it's good news about a God who loves us, and a God who loves us enough to send Jesus to die and to rise again in order to save us and to restore the broken relationship between man and God. And Christianity is about living a life putting God at the centre rather than ourselves. And I think what some people can get wrong about that is that they think that is a bad way to live. But I'd say that actually God knows us, he loves us, and he knows us intimately. And so he absolutely knows the best way for us to live.
Okay, thank you. And again, feel free to come back in the Q&A a little later on in that. So your area of expertise is genetics. It is still a relatively new field, but I understand sample has come a very long way in just 20 years, mainly due to you and poppy pollen discovery projects, I'm sure. But just track that for us. What's kind of happened for those who haven't kept up with how the world is fast moving forward?
I'd love to claim that I have a much bigger part in the explosive change in genetics, but I'm a small clinical scientist in a big pond. It's changed unbelievably. Basically, since I started out my career in genetics about 20 years ago, the human genome had only just been sequenced and mapped, and it's pretty unbelievable to think that took 13 years and cost nearly $3 billion. And over the past 20 years, and especially I'd say over the last 10 years, there's been such an explosive growth in sequencing technology and bioinformatics that we can now sequence a genome in a matter of days, if not a day, and it costs $1,000, if not less. And actually, there's so many companies competing to get those costs down that you can, if you Google it, you could see some companies touting the price of $10 or $100 to sequence a genome. So that really has absolutely transformed the way we do genetics and therefore can interrogate human disease.
I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, it must blow your mind as
It
something
really does, yeah.
as to how quickly it's all changing. And how do you feel about that as a Christian? I mean, what excites you about the work that you do and these developments? And then, does anything sort of slightly worry you about this extraordinary abilities that we're developing to sort of know ourselves in that sort of a way?
I think in the area that I'm in, I think overall it's overwhelmingly positive. I think the more we're able to sequence people's genomes, especially those who are actually showing signs of being ill already, we can hopefully provide an answer to why those people are ill. So I think one of the most exciting things about my work, or the thing that motivates me or is most rewarding, is that there are patients and there are families at the end of what I'm doing. And for some of those people, they're very ill and they've been waiting a very long time for a diagnosis. So I think with some of these complex genetic disorders, sometimes if you see a doctor, they can't actually give a definitive clinical diagnosis because it's so broad what could be wrong with them. So it's often only when you get to genetic diagnosis that you actually get an answer to what's wrong. And I think sometimes there are treatments for some disorders when you find what's wrong, but for a lot of people, it's just having a name for what is wrong. And I think genetic counsellors will especially tell us in our field that just having a name for what is wrong with either your child or yourself really has a huge psychological benefit. So that's probably one of the most rewarding reasons for doing it.
And anything slightly scary you about this? Where we're all going?
I guess sometimes, well, there's lots of private companies popping up offering genetic tests left, right and centre. I think sometimes genetics, possibly in the wrong hands and without counselling, can be misunderstood. So I think, I remember actually doing a talk at my husband Will works in a reinsurance company, so I went and did a talk about 10 years ago now. But just looking at companies like 23andMe, which are not bad companies, but I think if you send off your DNA and you get results saying you've got a potential increased chance of getting X, Y, or Z, what do you do with that? Do you need counselling for it? I think there's also there's ethical areas around prenatal testing as well. There's a lot of that in my field, and that's a very tricky subject, which can evoke lots of emotions, which I'm happy to talk to people about one-on-one later. And I think there's some testing in that area which is used for really good things, and there's a lot of testing in that area which can be used for harm. So I think it's really mixed.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're drawing to a close. You've been so helpful thinking on your feet all the way through this. Just a couple of closing sort of questions. This work that you do, how does being a Christian, does it in any way change your work?
Yeah, I think probably a couple of things. I think one of the main ways it changes my work day to day is I want to work really hard to honour God in what I do. And I think, especially I work at home a lot. See, that's changed for some people since the pandemic. My boss can't see me day to day, but it doesn't matter if she can see me because I know God sees me. So it motivates me to work hard. But I certainly know that for people who aren't Christians, that's certainly the case for many people too. But I'd say the other area that it does change the way that I work is in the area of ethics. So because of the Bible's teaching on the sanctity of life, there's certain areas of my work that's definitely made me think long and hard about whether I should be involved in. And I think there was probably one specific example when I worked at Great Ormond Street about 8 years ago, where I was asked to be involved in implementing a new kind of test, which I originally said yes to, and then went home in the evening and just, it sat really, really uncomfortably with me. And I had to go back to my boss the next day and say, as a Christian, I just don't feel comfortable doing this. And thankfully, he was very understanding about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You said that the more you look at the human genome, the more it confirms you in your faith. Many of your colleagues don't share your faith. What do you think they see that, or what do you see that they don't see as they go about the same kind of work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've got quite a small little team of clinical scientists, and I don't think any of them are Christians, so that is true. Before answering the question, it's probably worth pointing out that there are lots and lots of scientists who are Christians. In fact, one of the most probably famous of our time is Francis Collins, who actually headed up the Human Genome Project and was the director of the National Institute of Health in America for 12 years. So there are plenty of us around and much more famous and prominent scientists than me. But yeah, to answer the question, why don't others see it? I think it must come down to what people's worldview is. And I think if we all were to ask ourselves here tonight, I think we all know that we came into this room with a set worldview. So that will have come to you by your family, your friends, the culture around you. And I think for my colleagues, I guess they have a set worldview that God doesn't exist. And so that's the lens through which they will see everything, even when faced with what I think is the blindingly obvious complexity of DNA that they look at every day. And I think that that must explain why they don't see it. And it's a big mind shift to change from God doesn't exist to being open to the possibility that he does. But obviously, it's possible that people change their mind. I'm testament to that, and plenty of others. And I guess maybe a question that I'd want to ask people here tonight is, are you willing to have your worldview re-examined and look at the Bible with an open mind? So that's what people asked me to do over 20 years ago, to actually look at the Bible and explore what the Christian message was. And I did do that, and I did change my mind and my worldview, and ultimately the rest of my life. So I'd encourage anyone here to do the same.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for all that you've shared with us this evening. One last question, if I may, particularly about your work, but what makes you glad to be a Christian?
I think there's so many ways of answering that, but I think probably knowing that I love unconditionally by God, just as I am, and I don't have to earn that, which is amazingly liberating. And I think we live in a world where we see lots of people, and including myself, when I can get it wrong, chasing after things that the world has to offer us, which tells us will give us our joy and our satisfaction and our value. And I think ultimately we all know that actually anything in this world that this world has to offer doesn't give us that. And as a Christian, knowing that that's not true, and actually that my joy and my satisfaction and my value comes from being known and loved by God, is an amazing truth.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for being willing to come here to share a very personal story with us, to help us with some of the complexities of science and faith and so on. And it's been great to have you here tonight. Let's show our appreciation for that. Okay, well, do continue to enjoy the brownie or the cake or the biscuit, whatever it is that you're enjoying eating. And I'm just going to speak for a few minutes as a non-scientist. I did do biology A-level, so I mean, I can help a little bit, but not much. As my focus will be really trying to think about Christianity and faith as someone who's been a leader of a church for over 20 years, and thought a little about these and had many, many stimulating conversations with people of all faiths and just trying to help people as they think through these important questions. And one of the most regular questions that I tend to get asked by people who are just puzzled by Christians is this one. They say something like this: well, if God is there, surely he'd make it more obvious. It's a really good question, isn't it? If God's there, why wouldn't he make it more obvious? He could, couldn't he? Couldn't he just write it in the sky, I am here, or something like that? Or appear to each one? I mean, what God could do lots of things if he's God. And one of the questions is, why doesn't God make it more obvious? I mean, I used to play hide and seek with my son, and he'd go off and hide, and you'd hear the giggling from behind the shower curtain. And the point was, he wanted to be found. You know, he was desperate to be found so he could start all over again. And he'd giggle until you found him. And the question is, well, if God plays hide and seek, why doesn't he want to be found? And I think that's a great question that we're going to think about a little bit here tonight for just a few minutes. So there can be no good reason for God to hide if he's interested in people like you and me. And the claim of the Christian faith, as we've already heard this evening, is God really is interested in people. We ended, didn't it? What's the greatest joy of being Christian? What makes you glad? And it's to know God, Natalie said, to know that I'm loved by him. So I want to start by saying that when we ask the question, well, God, where are you and why don't you make it more obvious? I want to say that, to begin with, I think maybe God is more obvious than we realise. Maybe it's a little bit more obvious than we realise. We just haven't maybe paused and stopped and thought about it. Now, if you want me to prove that God is there to you by some kind of scientific experiment or mathematical formula, you know that I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm in big trouble if that's what you want. And that's because I don't think you can prove God's existence through a mathematical formula. But the reality is, all the things that really matter to us can't be discovered in that way. I'm going to give you 3 examples of things that I'm firmly convinced are true. I kind of would live and die for them, not all of them. You can work out which ones in a moment. But none of them can I prove to you. Okay, here are my 3. My wife loves me. Mozart was a genius. Murder is wrong. Now, I've got no science to justify those 3 convictions. My wife loves me, Mozart was a genius, murder is wrong. But I passionately believe in each of those truths, as I want to call them, but I can't prove them. And actually the things that matter to us most can't be proven in that way. But it doesn't mean they aren't true, does it? My wife loves me. I've based a lot of my life on that fact, because I think there are lots of compelling reasons to believe that that's real, even though I can't prove it to you. So let me say how I think God has made himself obvious to us. That's what I'm going to try and do in just a few minutes. Firstly, when we look at the Bible, one of the things that the Bible says is that God has made himself real through what he has made. So that might be the individual human cell. It might be the genome, these 3 billion, this kind of 3 billion code. Or it could be the cosmos, the entire universe, and just about everything in between. So there's a book in the Bible. It's actually, if you open a Bible in the middle, you'd find this book. It's called the Book of Psalms. And in Psalm 19, we read this: the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. And listen to this next. I mean, it's poetry, but listen to the next line. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. So when you look at the night sky, if you can see it tonight, it's not too cloudy, as you go home and look at the night sky, what the Bible says is God is speaking to you through the world that he has made. Joanna Lumley is a national treasure. She's one of that elite club. And Joanna Lumley once took a trip to see the Northern Lights. Has anyone seen the Northern Lights? It's on my bucket list. I'd love to go and see them. She went up to see the Northern Lights, and she lay down in the snow and just looked up at the night sky, and she simply said, "Thank you." She didn't say, "Wow." She didn't say, "This was amazing." She said, "Thank you." And she kept saying, thank you, thank you. I don't know who she was thanking, actually, but there was some kind of connection. She understood that they were in that night sky for a purpose, and there was someone that needed to be praised. But I'd argue that modern science, rather than making it harder to believe in God, is also giving us more reasons to believe. So it's not just the night sky, it's what's discovered down in a microscope and in a test tube and everywhere else. And lo and behold, we're back to this chap, Professor Antony Flew. And Antony Flew is a professor at Reading University. And if you do one of these Google calculations, who is the most cited philosopher of religion, you'll come up with the answer, Professor Antony Flew. And he was the Richard Dawkins of his day. He was an ardent atheist who wrote philosophically about his atheism. But he wrote a book by this title, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And in it, he wrote these words, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. This is in his 80s. Why do I believe that? Given that I expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century? The short answer is this. This is the world picture as I see it that is emerged from modern science. It's science that took him to faith in a God, or a belief in a God. Science, far from disproving God, Flew argues, makes it pretty much impossible to explain our universe as we know it, or as we've come to know it through science. The mathematics are staggering. Stephen Hawking has estimated that if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 100,000 million, 1 second after the Big Bang, the universe would have either collapsed in on itself or never developed galaxies. Now, I can't do the maths there as what is 1 part in 100,000 million, but it's big, isn't it? It's estimated that the gravitational force, if it were different by 1 part in 10 to the power 40, that's a 10 followed by 40 zeros. If the gravitational force were different by just that amount, our sun would not exist. And we would not be here. Flew looked at modern science and finds in it overwhelming reasons to believe in a God. Do you remember the psalmist said 3,000 years ago, day after day, the stars, the sky, the creation, it's pouring forth speech. And Antony Flew discovered that to be true for him. That's where he was finding a belief in God, the universe of law and order, of complexity, of apparent design. He decided could not have originated from nothing. And he says this towards the end of the book. He says, having looked at all the extraordinary mathematical improbability of our universe even being here and so on, he said, look, if we're struggling to say, well, where is God? Why doesn't he prove himself? This is what Flew says. He says, well, what exactly should have to occur or to have occurred to constitute for us a reason to at least consider the existence of a superior mind? In other words, how much more does God have to do to show you the extraordinary complexity of design of our universe? Amos Penzias is an American physicist, apparently, radio astronomer, Nobel laureate for physics. He was the co-discoverer of the cosmic microwave background radiation. In other words, Big Bang. He was the guy who proved that Big Bang was more than a theory, but true. And this is what he had to say. He said, the best data we have are exactly what I could have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, that's Genesis, Exodus, the first books of the Bible, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. He said, we haven't advanced our thinking in the slightest by discovering this cosmic background radiation. We've just discovered what actually is written in the words of this book thousands of years ago. So God reveals himself through creation is the conclusion not just of people who believe, but people who come to believe because of what they see in the world that God has made. God isn't hiding, he's pouring forth speech all the time through the world that he has made, to the extent that Professor Antony Flew could see that for himself. Secondly, God reveals himself through what the Bible calls our consciences. In other words, the convictions of our hearts. So do you remember I said Merlin is wrong? Well, that's not a scientific fact. That is actually a conviction, a moral conscience that says that some things are wrong, have always been wrong, always will be wrong, forever. It's not just the universe out there through which God is speaking. He's speaking to us through our hearts or our consciences that reveal God to us. So again, all of those things that we're really committed to, issues of truth, justice, beauty, love, right and wrong, depend on our universe being a moral universe. And men like Richard Dawkins have been at least honest enough to acknowledge that fact. He says if behind this universe is that there is no God, then he will freely admit there is no such thing as good or evil, right or wrong. He says the universe just is, and it's a place of blind, pitiless indifference. The universe just doesn't care, because it's not a moral universe if there is no God. But all of the things that you and I will march for and stand for, maybe live and die for, truth, beauty, love, right, they depend on our universe being a moral universe. And your conscience says those things are real. And we must stand up against injustice and so on and so on. Will Province, a professor of history of science at Cornell University, in a debate not many years before his death, described his view as this: no gods, no life after death, no foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, no human free will are at all connected to an evolutionary perspective. What a dark view of reality, ultimate reality. And everything in the arts and culture and life and family, everything about us cries out against that and says it's not true. It's not true. God is speaking to you in those moments. Because if your view is the universe is a place of blind, pitiless indifference, your heart is saying something else. So God is speaking through the creation, God is speaking through our conscience. But of course, supremely as Christians, we would want to say to you tonight that God speaks to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. You see, Christianity isn't a set of rules, the to-do list that Matthew mentioned. It isn't just a subjective emotion. I like to believe there could be something after we're done. Christianity stands or falls on the claim that the God who is there came into our world in the person of Jesus Christ, who lived, died for that claim, but was then resurrected from the dead, never to die again, but to enter into heaven. And you've got a little book on your tables. It's called Luke's Gospel. It's one of the 4 biographies of the life of Jesus that we find in our Bibles, and we've just sort of separated that out so you can take it away with you. Luke was a physician, he was a doctor, he was a scientist of his time, but he was also a historian. I'm just going to put that down, so I can't juggle, I can't evolve another hand, so just write that down. This is what he says at the very beginning of his book that you can take away and read for yourself. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So this is a claim to be writing history based on eyewitness testimony. With this in mind, since I myself had carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So this is Luke's Gospel, written by a scientist and a historian who has interviewed and met the eyewitnesses and then recorded this for us to read. And I invite you to take it away and consider it, because everything stands or falls on the claims that Jesus lived, that he claimed to be God, that he died for that claim, and that he rose again from the dead. And that's not an easy thing to believe now, and it wasn't an easy thing to believe back then. These were no mugs. who thought they saw ghosts and supernatural things around every corner. Just turn to page 79 and you'll see their struggle with this total change of worldview that they experienced in meeting God in human form. Page 79, you'll see a heading there, Jesus appears to the disciples. This is after his death, and now Jesus appearing to them alive again, supernaturally resurrected. So there's a little verse number there, it says 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened. See, this is eyewitness history. These are not people who want to believe that Jesus is still alive. They are startled and frightened because it smashed their worldview to pieces. This should not happen in our world. Dead people don't get up again. What is going on? This is the scariest thing they've ever encountered. They thought the only way they could rationalize it and think about it, they thought they saw a ghost. That's the only framework they had. But he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet." The nails, the holes in his hands and feet where the nails were driven in with his crucifixion. It is I myself. Touch me, no ghost, touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, in other words, reality had not sunk in, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of boiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And look, if that really happened, and Luke claims to be a historian, he's an eyewitness testimony, that changes reality for everyone. Whatever views we came in tonight with, we go away with that big challenge that God isn't hiding. God is real. He has revealed himself through the creation, as Anthony Flew discovered. He's revealed himself and continues to reveal himself to our conscience. We refuse to believe that this is an amoral universe. Supremely, he reveals himself by coming into our world in human form, so there can be no doubt about it anymore, to live, to die, to rise again from the dead, to prove what even people who had followed him couldn't believe, startled, frightened, but then convinced. God is real. And this God who came into the world came not just to prove that he's there, but as we've already heard from Natalie's story, because he came to die on a cross, to take upon himself that penalty for all the wrong things that we've ever said or thought or done as we pushed away from God and pushed away and hurt other people, and all of that wrongdoing, that shadow side to our lives that we really, really don't want anyone to ever know about. And Jesus says, "I'm ready to take that away onto myself, to pay for it in full, so that you can be restored to a relationship with God, the very thing that you were made for." So God is speaking. I hope he's speaking to us tonight through the creation, through our conscience, through Christ, in the words of this book that I encourage you to take away and read. And then he's also, just very briefly, speaking to us through the story of Christians here tonight. So maybe you've come along with someone because they invited you to come, and you know that they're a Christian. We heard from Natalie again that it was meeting Christians that kind of made her just think a little bit, could there be something in this? Now, the Christian that you come with won't have answers to all of your questions or anything like that, but they have a story to tell as well of how they came to know God personally. And it might be tonight or at some other point over a pint that you just have a chat with them about. So tell me about this for you. What's your story? We've heard Natalie's story tonight. What's your story? Maybe that'll be a good thing to do at some point. Thank you so much for listening.
we've had plenty of food for thought in the first evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And we also have a huge amount of excellent questions here on the Slido. Feel free to keep upvoting those that you like the look of and adding your own. This is a chance we'll be picking up any of the themes that we've heard already this evening, perhaps digging in a bit more to them. And we've got here the first question that's received the most votes, actually, has picked up on the theme of suffering, I guess, saying, how do you combine faith in a loving God with the existence of debilitating genetic diseases? I guess that's part of what you're seeing within your work, especially in children.
Yes, so that is probably the most obvious question to ask, and it's a hard question. I think being a Christian doesn't make me immune from the fact that I don't see the patients directly, but I know the devastating impacts of these diseases, and it is heartbreaking. So how do I reconcile that? I think actually the Bible does give us an answer for why there is pain and there is suffering in this world, and that is that the world is broken. It's not the way it was meant to be. It's not the way it was created. God did create a perfect world where there wasn't any pain and there wasn't any suffering, and there will be that world again, but we live in the middle times after humankind rejected God and what the Bible calls sin entered the world, and what we now see with pain and suffering. And I think as a Christian, actually, at least the Bible does give that explanation to pain and suffering, and we have a reason why we find it hard. And the Bible's not shy about talking about the fact that it's hard. And I guess I would say, actually, say, for example, if you're not a Christian, but actually you think that what Dawkins says is true, he calls us survival mechanisms of DNA, and as you referred to, just kind of this world is just blind chance. And if that's the case, that we're just here by chance, then we wouldn't care, as harsh as that sounds, if people are suffering, and we wouldn't find it hard, and we wouldn't necessarily find it hard that people suffer and have pain, but we know that that isn't the human experience. So I'd say actually the fact that we even asked that question, for me, points more to the normal universe that Neil was alluding to, and the fact that there is a God behind it. No, it's not. It's never going to be a fully satisfactory answer, but that's the answer I'd have.
Was there anything you'd like to add, Neil, as someone who has pastored people through suffering?
Well, I think there's so many different angles you could take that are each important in their own right. So I would say to someone who was just deeply troubled by suffering that they'd experienced, the loss of a loved one, their own personal health issues, whatever it might be, mental, physical, or spiritual, whatever it might be, is that Christianity says that God knows what you are going through, because God himself took flesh, became a human being. So that what your experience is something that God understands if the gospel is true. If this Jesus is who we say he is, then only Christianity makes that claim that God knows what it is to be tired, God knows what it is to be hungry, God knows what it is to be marginalized and ostracized, rejected by friends, God knows what it is to suffer and die, and therefore there's nothing that you're going through that you can't bring to God, because he knows. And that is a great comfort to people going through some very crazy, difficult days. Really? Does that mean I can tell him anything? Absolutely, you can tell God anything, because he can relate to it. He's not distant. He's come into our world. So I think that's the sort of pastoral note I would probably give. And I think also to say, well, for those who find faith in Christ, we can know and be absolutely sure that suffering will come to an end, that it's real, but it is temporary. And the Bible ends with the message that there will one day be a renewed, restored creation in which there will be no more sickness, No more suffering, no more injustice, no more pain, no more death. The end of this world is coming about. So, just if you're not persuaded or if you're still wrestling with this question, can I ask, do you think that this world is broken? Because to say it's broken is to say that it's not the way it should be. And again, sorry to single out Richard Dawkins, I just think he's been remarkably brave and said what others are reluctant to say, that he's that kind of guy who just say it. You say, the world isn't broken. This is the way things are, always have been and always will be. And it doesn't mean you have to be heartless and have no compassion. I'm not saying that at all. But what he can't give you is any hope. There's no hope in that message. Because the universe is his word, his choice of word, pitiless and indifferent to human suffering. But if God is the God of the Bible who has come and suffered in our place and promised us a world without suffering to come, then that gives us great comfort in this life and hope for the next one.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful, those answers. The next question we've got is actually sort of two questions rolled into one. One is, for you, Natalie, has having a Christian faith reduced your credibility amongst peers in the scientific world? Then it mentions this question, you're speaking about your belief in a creator God and how that comes together with an idea of evolution. So using that as an example.
In terms of the credibility amongst peers, I'm not in academia. I think that would probably be more of a significant question if I was, but certainly amongst my peers in my clinical science team, they all know I'm a Christian. In fact, they've all watched a similar interview to this that I did in London, and when I told them that I was coming to do this today, they were all overwhelmingly positive and said, wow, that's really interesting, kind of, you did a great job last time, so no kind of, wow, you idiot kind of response. So that's encouraging. So not lost credibility in that sense. But interestingly, on the credibility, there's actually a guy that Will and I know who is at a church in London, who is actually a professor at Queen Mary University. And he's done an amazing inaugural lecture that people can find on YouTube. His name's Richard Buggs, or Professor Richard Buggs. And he certainly hasn't lost credibility amongst his peers for being a scientist. He's a very outspoken Christian, and actually as part of his inaugural lecture, he talked about the Darwinian tree of life, and he looks into trees, so he kind of did some clever wordplay on the tree of life that he was looking at, and just points out that there are holes in Darwin's theory of evolution. It's not a fact, it is a theory. So I would encourage anyone who has questions on that to go and watch that lecture. He's a much cleverer scientist than I am.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit earlier about, which questions go to who and so on, and we also thought it was helpful to say that Christians do have differing views on origins of life in terms of mechanism, how human life got here. Is there a place for evolution? And it's fair to say there are Christians who hold different views on that. So if you meet a Christian, they may say, no, not a Christian, because what we're talking about is the mechanism. And I don't think, personally, the early chapters of the Bible really are there to tell us the exact way that human life came to be, but they're very much to tell us, if not the how, in terms of mechanisms, they're very much there to tell us why and what for, if not how. And there are Christians that take, so Francis Collins was mentioned earlier. He was the first person to map the human genome. He's received presidential awards from 3 different US presidents, including the Presidential Medal of Honor. And he is sort of a full-on Bible-believing evangelical Christian who has written on mapping the genome and his own Christian faith and other things. And if you're not a reader, look him up on YouTube. There's a bunch of lectures and short talks and extracts. Francis Collins might be just a good person to start with while we're on the genetic subject tonight.
Great, thank you. The question here, I don't know which of you want to take it. Do you think that Adam and Eve were actual people, or do they represent multiple people? perhaps in order to avoid incest?
I can have a stab at that and then you can follow on. Yes, I think they are real people. I think the Bible, like Neil just said, it's not necessarily, it's not claiming to be a scientific textbook. I think we don't know if there were other people, and actually Adam and Eve were the ones that the author chose to write about. But even if there were, kind of throw out the possibility that actually right at the beginning, when the world was made, and as we've said, the world was made perfect, so at that point there weren't genetic mutations in our genome, maybe incest actually wouldn't have been a bad thing back then. I'm not saying it wouldn't be, but that's plausible. Don't know if you've got anything to add.
No, I think for me it's a personal note, which is that Jesus talks of Adam as being a literal human being. Who else was around at the time? Again, Christians will, I think, take differing views, but it seems very important to me that Adam was one person, and at the origins of human life, of human beings made in the image of God, with a consciousness of God, made to relate to God, have their origins in those first human beings of Adam and Eve. And that's essentially because that's Jesus' own position, where he talks about the historicity of Adam.
There's a similar question here, picking up on the story of Noah's Ark in the Bible, and asking what do we understand genetically to be going on in that story?
I think we don't know really the answer, the simple answer to that. But I'd probably go back to what I just said, which is actually right at the beginning, there will not have been as many genetic mutations as there are now, because actually the genome would have been perfect at the start, so it wouldn't have been so much of an issue. But I think the simple answer is we don't know.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. I think we've already touched upon reconciling Christianity with evolution. You mentioned that. Perhaps if there's more that people would like to understand about that, to come and chat to you. How about this? How do you feel about the human genetic intervention like CRISPR?
I'd be intrigued for the person asking that question is what are using CRISPR to do what? So it's basically a mechanism to splice genes, so you can basically make constructs with genes with things put in and out. So you could remove a genetic mutation, for example, and put in what's called the wild type, so the normal DNA, and then you can put those cells back into either into just cells that are in a petri dish, or maybe into mice or something like that, and I guess possibly in the future into humans. So I mean, if what's the question? What are my thoughts on it? So I mean, I guess people will differ on this, and like Neil alluded to with the evolution question, Christians will differ. I think ultimately I don't have an issue with it if it's used for good. So as we've spoken about, the world is broken and it's not the way that it's meant to be. And I think if humans are trying to correct it back to the way it was meant to be, so you know, if we could potentially heal someone who has a debilitating disease without causing harm, then I don't think I've got a big issue with that. It isn't an area I've thought a lot about. It's I only came across CRISPR when I was in a lab a few years ago, and it's not something I look at day to day. It's not something I've thought a lot about. So I probably want to go away and think more about that before someone quoted me on that answer.
Well, there's another question here about, you mentioned that there was a specific test that you felt uncomfortable with. Is that something you prefer to talk about privately, or do you mind going into that in this context anymore?
I don't mind mentioning it, but I will just emphasise again that I realise that prenatal diagnosis is an incredibly sensitive subject, and there could be people in this room for which it could be a hard topic. The particular testing that I was asked to be involved in is called non-invasive prenatal diagnosis, which is where a pregnant lady can have a blood sample taken, and from that maternal blood you can check for some genetic mutations in the unborn baby. And I think at the time when I was asked to do that, even amongst doctors or genetic counsellors, there was some concern that a pregnant lady having a blood test might not necessarily realise the huge implications of that test, because before the non-invasive testing came along, in order to do a genetic test on an unborn baby, required sticking a needle into a pregnant lady's, or it still does, this still happens, into the belly, which can cause spontaneous abortion. So if you're going to choose to have that test, you absolutely know that it's a big deal to have that test done, and you'll have a lot of counselling to deal with the potential implications of what a result of that test might be. But with the non-invasive diagnosis, we all know that having a blood test is quite a simple thing to have done. And so it was more thinking through the ease of it, whether counselling was in place, and the potential implications of the results of that test that I didn't feel comfortable with.
Thank you. That's helpful to hear. There's a question here about you mentioned murder as something you hold to be wrong, Neil. And why did God tell Israelites in the Bible to kill so many people if murder is wrong?
Great question, an important question. So these are all difficult words, really fixed there, isn't it? So there's a difference to most people between murder and killing. So it's not always wrong to take a life. So if you believed in something like just war theory, then in order to defend yourself against attackers, you might be willing to take a life. There are, of course, some people whose religious convictions mean that they're pacifists and would never think it was appropriate. So some was Quakers, for example, and for Quakers, they would not choose to get involved in armed conflict, and many of them pacifists who served in World Wars I and II in other ways, did serve the nation in other ways. So not all killing is wrong, and for most of the world and most of human history, capital punishment has been something that has been accepted as justified in extreme cases, such as the taking of an innocent life by somebody else might mean you forfeit your life. So not all killing is murder, is what I want to say at the start. And I think, depending quite where people wanted to point me to in the Bible, I would suggest that where you find the taking of life in the Bible, it's either as a form of capital punishment, which is, as I say, practiced in many parts of the world today and over most of human history, or it's in a situation of war.
Thank you, that's helpful. Another question for you, Neil, about you spoke from this account written by Luke, and you spoke from he was a historian, but we have to accept that he was biased because he was a believer, he was a Christian. So how can we use that as proof when we're going on the basis of what he's saying as someone with bias?
Again, really a great question, and to have to address it in 30 seconds is impossible. So I'm going to do another YouTube pitch. I commend to you a man called Peter Williams, who's the principal of a place called Tyndale House at Cambridge University, and he is a leading thinker in all aspects of the origins, formation, reliability of the New Testament, in particular, looking at the Gospels. He's done lots of talks everywhere around the world on this topic. If you know Orlando knows him quite well, don't you, Orlando? And he's got a very, very big brain and can take you through different pieces of the evidence for why we might be able to believe that what is written here in the Bible is accurate, historically, verifiably accurate. Let me just give you one thing that's important to know, which is probably at the very heart of our Christian faith. We talked about the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and there seem to be three facts recorded in the Gospels that seem to most scholars to be universally recognised as accurate, reliable, and true. And there's something for us to think about as we go away, as we think, well, what did happen to the body of Jesus Christ, if we can believe that he was crucified? And there are many secular sources, all written within the time of Jesus and the disciples, who record that the crucifixion happened. These three facts would be that the tomb of Jesus was discovered to be empty, that his disciples claimed to have seen him resurrected from the dead and were willing to die for that claim. And in fact, all but one of Jesus' early disciples was killed for that claim. Only John, who wrote John's Gospel, seemed to have lived out a natural life and died a natural death. All of the others were martyred for this claim. And that it was this claim, the resurrection of Jesus, that spread across the known world at an astonishing rate, even though it was unprecedented and unparalleled in human history. So scholars on all sides of the debate would accept those as verifiable facts of history. The tomb was empty, that his disciples lived and died on the claim that they'd seen him resurrected from the dead, and that was the claim that spread throughout the ancient world, right across the Roman Empire. And whatever our personal convictions and beliefs are, these are facts that are, in that sense, non-negotiables, that if we want to reject and have the Christian claim, we've got to come up with alternative explanations for those facts of history.
Thank you, that's helpful. There's a question here. Natalie, you mentioned that tornado example creating a jet, but this is helpfully throwing in the idea of multiverse theory. And if there was enough time and space available, would there still not be a possibility that could be the means of creating even a type of judo?
I guess that is plausible. I want to answer the question, how many multiverses and time would it take to create that jet? And I guess I'd want to ask the question, do you actually believe that that's more likely than that there's a God behind this universe?
Thank you.
And it's one strand of evidence, and only one strand of evidence. It's the cumulative evidence that we've tried to set before you a little bit tonight. But obviously, with Natalie's specialisation in sciences, that's been more of our focus. But it's about historicity, it's about moral law, it's about personal justice, and so on. We talked on our table to say, look, essentially, when it comes to the origins or the universe or whatever we might think, really, there seem to me to be only three positions. One is a self-regulating universe, and given that there's no precedent for anything coming to existence out of nothing, out of literally nothing, that is an act of faith, I would suggest, to be a self-creating universe. Or an eternal universe, which contracts and expands and contracts. However often it does it, it's either come out of nothing, or it's eternal, or you believe in an eternal God who created a universe. And I want to say, I think all three are faith positions. A self-creating universe seems to me to defy the laws of logic, but if you want to believe it, you can as a matter of faith. An eternal universe, well, that's a faith position. An eternal God who created the universe. So I think we're choosing between different faith positions at that point. There is no neutral ground, in other words. You hold a position of faith when you think about why is the universe here. Whichever one of those three you opt for, the question is, well, where does the rest of the evidence suggest? Where does it take you beyond that?
Great, thank you. And the final question for you both would be helpful to speak into. We've spoken a lot tonight about the idea of faith and reason, having evidence behind faith. It might be helpful just to kind of conclude all that we've been hearing, to hear from you, in your own experience, what have been the things that have pointed you towards reasonable faith? And indeed, as others perhaps are thinking about those questions for themselves, what would help others on their own exploration in that regard?
So I guess as I shared in the story of my conversion, I don't know if this church holds a Christianity Explored course or something similar. That's the best thing I would commend to people in terms of actually opening up the Bible and looking at the person of Jesus for yourself. There is, I guess that's where my eyes were open to the person of Jesus, and just looking at the eyewitness accounts of who Jesus is, who he claims to be, what he did. So that would be the best place that I would recommend, and that was the most important key thing for me.
I echo that largely. Well, absolutely. I think just to complement that, rather than just saying that again in a different way, I remember walking around Auschwitz and just trying to take in what I was seeing and trying to process and understand and interpret the mass extermination of millions of innocent men, women and children, born out of a political ideal, and thinking, wow, I can't go to a place where this means nothing intellectually. I can't follow Dawkins down the logic that he wants to take me. Pitiless indifference is what the universe says about Auschwitz. I just could never go there. So everything, I've got a big heart, everything about me wants to say human life is sacred. Human life, all of human life needs to be protected. The most vulnerable members of our society needed to be treated not just with the same dignity, but with special dignity. And it's the doctrine of human beings made in the image of God that means that Christians have fought for human rights, whether it's Martin Luther King or William Wilberforce or many others down the centuries. And so it gives me a reason to get out of bed in the morning and to fight for what's right in this world, because there's a God who has made us for himself. So that's not that, I just use that as a compliment. So it's different days, it's different things that keep me going as a Christian, but I just give that as a compliment to what Matthew said.
Great, thank you so much. I hope you'll agree that we've had a real treat tonight listening to such interesting answers to really great questions. Why don't we give a round of applause to thank the panel.